Housewife's confession, when routine became my prison. Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old suburban housewife from Westfield, New Jersey, appears to have the perfect life, a successful husband, 2 teenage children, and a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. But beneath the surface of her meticulously maintained routine lies a woman drowning in silent desperation. When a chance encounter with an old friend forces Sarah to confront the person she used to be versus who she's become, she embarks on a journey of self-discovery that threatens to unravel everything she thought she wanted. This is the story of one woman's courageous decision to break free from the golden cage of suburban perfection and reclaim her identity, one honest conversation at a time. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or overwhelmed in your own home, you're not alone. This channel is a safe place for every woman who's lived through love, heartbreak, and the silent battles of family life. Subscribe now, and let's share our stories together, because your voice matters here. Chapter 1. The Perfect Morning Routine. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn silence at 5:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before David's alarm would sound. Sarah Mitchell's hand moved with practiced precision, silencing the device before it could disturb her husband's sleep. The bedroom was still draped in darkness, save for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through their blackout curtains she'd spent 3 weeks researching to find the perfect shade of charcoal that would complement their bedroom's color scheme. Sarah slipped from beneath the Egyptian cotton sheets, her bare feet finding the plush area rug David had surprised her with last Christmas. The house was her domain during these quiet morning hours, a kingdom of routines she'd perfected over the past 15 years of marriage. Every movement was choreographed, every task timed to the minute. The hardwood floors creaked softly under her weight as she padded downstairs, muscle memory guiding her through the darkness. She didn't need lights. She could navigate this house blindfolded. Kitchen first, start the coffee maker, prep David's lunch, check that Emma's soccer uniform was clean and ready. Then upstairs to wake 16-year-old Jake, followed by 14-year-old Emma, each requiring a different approach, a different tone of voice. The kitchen island was her command center, its granite surface reflecting the soft blue glow of the coffee maker's digital display. As the machine hummed to life, Sarah began her ballet of breakfast preparation. Turkey sandwich for David. Whole grain bread, mustard, no mayo, lettuce, but no tomato. She'd been making the same sandwich for 12 years, ever since his doctor mentioned his cholesterol levels. "Morning, honey." David's voice made her jump, even though he appeared at the kitchen entrance at exactly 6:15 a.m., just like every other weekday for the past decade. "Good morning," Sarah replied, not turning around as she wrapped his sandwich in parchment paper. "Your coffee's ready." "I pressed your navy suit. The blue tie is laid out on the bed." David poured his coffee into the travel mug she'd already set on the counter, adding exactly 1 teaspoon of sugar. No cream, another concession to the cholesterol conversation that had apparently redefined their morning routine forever. "Emma's got practice after school, right?" he asked, scrolling through his phone while taking his first sip. "Until 5:30, I'll pick her up." Sarah moved to the refrigerator, pulling out ingredients for the kids' lunches. "Jake has debate team today, so he'll be home late too." "Great. I might be late myself. Client dinner." David barely looked up from his phone screen. "Don't wait up." The words hung in the air like a familiar song Sarah had heard too many times to find meaningful. She nodded, already calculating how she'd spend another evening alone, probably reorganizing something that didn't need reorganizing, or watching Netflix shows she wouldn't remember the next day. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Jake's reluctant descent. At 16, he'd inherited his father's height and his mother's stubborn streak, though Sarah sometimes wondered if stubbornness was just a polite word for the quiet desperation they both seemed to carry. "Morning, sweetheart." Sarah turned toward her son, noting his wrinkled t-shirt and the way his dark hair stuck up at odd angles. "There's orange juice in the—" "Just coffee," Jake mumbled, heading straight for the coffee maker. "You're 16. You don't need—" "Mom, please. It's too early for the nutrition lecture." Sarah bit back her response, watching as Jake poured coffee into one of her good mugs, the ceramic ones she'd bought for special occasions that had somehow become everyday dishes. When had that happened? When had her special things become ordinary, unremarkable parts of a routine that felt more like sleepwalking than living? Emma bounded into the kitchen with the energy only teenagers seemed to possess before 7 a.m. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, soccer uniform crisp and ready, cleats dangling from her hand by their laces. "Mom, Can you drive Madison to practice too? Her mom has that appointment thing. Of course, Sarah replied automatically, mental checklist adjusting to accommodate the extra stop. But we need to leave 5 minutes earlier. You're the best! Emma grabbed a granola bar from the pantry and planted a quick kiss on Sarah's cheek before heading toward the door. Love you. The warmth of her daughter's affection lingered for just a moment before dissolving into the morning's momentum. David finished his coffee, grabbed his briefcase, and paused at the kitchen entrance. Dinner's at Romano's if you want to join us, he said, though his tone suggested it was more courtesy than invitation. Probably around 8. Sarah considered it for a moment, getting dressed up, making conversation with David's colleagues and their wives, discussing vacation plans and home renovations and children's achievements. The prospect felt exhausting. I'll probably just stay in, she said. Catch up on some things around here. David nodded, already mentally gone. See you tonight. And then they were all gone. David to his law office, Jake reluctantly shuffling toward the school bus, Emma chattering excitedly about today's scrimmage as Sarah drove her and Madison across town. The house fell silent except for the dishwasher's gentle hum and the neighbor's dog barking at something only he could see. Sarah stood in her kitchen, still in her pajamas, surrounded by the evidence of a morning well executed. Dishes were washed, counters wiped clean, coffee maker already prepped for tomorrow. The routine was complete and it was only 8:30 a.m. She walked to the living room window and looked out at Maple Street, watching Mrs. Peterson from across the way retrieve her newspaper in a pink bathrobe that had seen better days. 2 houses down, the Johnson's sprinkler system activated with mechanical precision, sending arcs of water across their already perfect lawn. This was her life. This was what she'd built, what she'd chosen. A beautiful home in a safe neighborhood, a successful husband, healthy children, financial security. She should feel grateful, fulfilled, content. Instead, she felt like she was suffocating in slow motion. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the window glass, a woman who looked older than her 38 years, wearing the same expression of quiet resignation she'd been practicing for so long it had become permanent. When had she stopped recognizing herself? When had the dreams she'd once harbored become so distant they felt like someone else's memories? The house phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. Sarah glanced at the caller ID. Her mother, right on schedule. Every Tuesday at 8:45 a.m. like clockwork. Hi, Mum. Sarah, honey, how are you? You sound tired. I'm fine. Just finished getting everyone off to school and work. That husband of yours better appreciate all you do. When your father was working those long hours, I made sure he knew exactly how much I was juggling at home. Sarah had heard this speech countless times, but today something about her mother's words struck differently. Had her mother felt this same creeping sense of invisibility? Had she stood in her own kitchen 30 years ago, wondering if this was all there was? Mom, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Sarah hesitated, not sure how to voice the question that had been forming in her mind. Did you ever, when we were kids, did you ever feel like you were disappearing, like bit by bit, you were just fading away? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if the call had dropped. Sarah, her mother said finally, her voice softer than usual. Are you all right? I'm fine. I don't know. Forget I asked. But as Sarah hung up the phone a few minutes later, she knew she couldn't forget. The question lingered, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. She looked around her pristine living room, the furniture she'd chosen, the photos she'd arranged, the life she'd curated so carefully, and felt like a stranger in her own home. The doorbell rang, interrupting her spiral of self-reflection. Through the peephole, she could see a woman with short brown hair and a warm smile, holding a clipboard and wearing a volunteer badge. Sarah almost didn't answer. She had laundry to fold, groceries to buy, a dozen small tasks that would fill her day with the illusion of purpose. But something made her open the door. Hi there, I'm Rebecca Chen from the Westfield Community Center. We're organizing a volunteer fair next month, and I wondered if you might be interested in getting involved. Sarah stared at the woman, Rebecca, noting her confident posture, the genuine enthusiasm in her eyes, the way she seemed to occupy space without apology. There was something familiar about her, but Sarah couldn't place it. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm the right person for... Wait, Rebecca interrupted, tilting her head slightly. Sarah Hoffman? The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Sarah Hoffman, The person she'd been before marriage, before mortgages, before the slow erosion of everything she'd thought she wanted to become. "It's Mitchell now," Sarah said quietly. "Sarah Mitchell." Rebecca's smile grew wider. "I can't believe it. We went to Rutgers together, journalism program. You were going to be the next Barbara Walters, remember?" The memory came flooding back. Late nights in the student newspaper office, the thrill of chasing stories, the absolute certainty that she would change the world one article at a time, and Rebecca, her study partner and closest friend, who'd shared her dreams and her ambitions and her belief that they could do anything. "Rebecca," Sarah whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "Wow, it's been 15 years at least. You just disappeared after graduation. I always wondered what happened to you." Sarah looked down at herself, still in her pajamas at 9 a.m., her hair unwashed, her face bare of makeup. This was not how she'd imagined reuniting with the friend who'd known her when she still believed in her own potential. "I got married," Sarah said, as if that explained everything. "Moved here, had kids, you know how it is." But Rebecca's expression suggested she didn't know how it was, or at least not in the same way Sarah did. There was something in her friend's eyes, concern maybe, or recognition of something Sarah wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah heard herself asking. "I was just about to make some fresh coffee." As Rebecca stepped into her carefully maintained home, Sarah felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if the presence of her former self, reflected in her old friend's eyes, had cracked something open that had been sealed shut for far too long. She didn't know what would spill out, but for the first time in years, she was curious enough to find out. Chapter 2. Coffee and Confessions. Sarah led Rebecca into the kitchen, hyper-aware of every pristine surface, every carefully placed decorative element. The morning sun streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes that danced above the breakfast nook, where her family rarely had time to actually eat breakfast together. "This is beautiful," Rebecca said, running her hand along the granite countertop. "You've built a lovely life here." The words should have felt like a compliment, but they settled heavy in Sarah's chest. Built a life, as if she were an architect of her own existence rather than someone who had simply let things happen to her, one small compromise at a time. "Thank you," Sarah replied, busying herself with the coffee maker. "How do you take your coffee?" "Black is fine. I've gotten used to it that way. Too many early mornings at the shelter." "Shelter?" Rebecca settled onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. "I run a women's shelter downtown. Started it about 8 years ago when I moved back from San Francisco." Sarah paused, coffee scoop halfway to the machine. San Francisco. She tried to picture Rebecca living in that vibrant city, making a difference in people's lives, building something meaningful from scratch. The image came easily. Rebecca had always possessed a certainty about her purpose that Sarah had envied even in college. "That's amazing," Sarah said, and meant it. "You always said you wanted to help people. What about you? I seem to remember you having big plans for investigative journalism, taking down corrupt politicians, exposing corporate scandals." Rebecca's eyes sparkled with the memory. "You were so passionate about uncovering the truth." Sarah turned away, focusing intently on the coffee preparation. The truth. What a concept. When was the last time she'd been interested in anyone's truth, including her own? "Life took a different turn," she said carefully. "David, my husband, he's a lawyer, corporate law, very successful, and with the kids and the house," she let the sentence trail off, hoping Rebecca would fill in the blanks with something more generous than what Sarah was thinking about her own choices. "Do you miss it? Writing, I mean." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Did she miss it? Sarah couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her what she missed, what she wanted, what she thought about anything beyond schedules and meal planning and keeping everyone else's life running smoothly. "I don't really have time to miss anything," Sarah said, which wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, studying Sarah's face with the same intensity she'd once brought to analyzing their journalism ethics assignments. "You know, we have a newsletter at the shelter. Nothing fancy, but we're always looking for someone who knows how to tell a story. The women there, they have such incredible stories of survival and strength. They deserve to have their voices heard." Sarah's hand stilled as she reached for the coffee mugs. "I haven't written anything in 15 years, Rebecca. I wouldn't even know where to start. But you used to be fearless with words. Remember that series you did on the campus housing discrimination? You interviewed dozens of students, tracked down administrators who didn't want to talk to you, spent weeks researching housing policies. You didn't just report the story, you made things change. The memory was so vivid Sarah could almost smell the cramped newspaper office, could feel the excitement that used to course through her veins when she was chasing a lead. That version of herself seemed like a character from a book she'd read long ago, someone interesting and brave and purposeful. "That was a lifetime ago," Sarah said softly. "Was it? Or was it just put aside?" Sarah poured the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to change the subject, to ask about Rebecca's work or talk about the weather, or anything that would steer them away from this uncomfortable examination of her abandoned dreams. But Rebecca's presence had awakened something that refused to be quieted. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, handing Rebecca her mug. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Rebecca leaned back in her chair, considering the question seriously. "I think I felt that way for a while, actually. Right after college, I took this job at a big PR firm in the city. Good money, nice office, all the things I thought I was supposed to want. But every morning I'd wake up with this knot in my stomach, like I was betraying myself just by getting dressed for work. What did you do?" "I quit, scared the hell out of my parents, gave up a six-figure salary, moved across the country with no plan except to figure out who I actually was when nobody was watching." Rebecca smiled. "Best decision I ever made." Sarah tried to imagine having that kind of courage, that willingness to leap into uncertainty. The thought alone made her feel dizzy. "I can't just quit being a mother, being a wife," Sarah said. "I have responsibilities." "I'm not suggesting you should." "But Sarah," Rebecca reached across the counter and touched Sarah's hand gently. "When we were in college, you used to talk about balance, about how the best journalists were the ones who brought their whole selves to their work, their experiences as daughters, friends, partners. You never saw family and career as opposites. What happened to that person?" Sarah pulled her hand away, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug as if it could anchor her. "That person was naive. She thought she could have everything, be everything. Reality has a way of teaching you otherwise. Or maybe reality has a way of making you forget what you actually wanted in the first place." The words stung because they felt true. When had she stopped dreaming? When had she started seeing her desires as obstacles to overcome, rather than goals to pursue? "I should get dressed," Sarah said abruptly, standing up from her stool. "I have errands to run, and Emma needs to be picked up from practice later and—" "Sarah." Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. "It's okay to want things. It's okay to miss the person you used to be." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, threatening to spill over. She hadn't cried in months. Not real tears, anyway. She'd gotten so good at swallowing her emotions, at pushing through each day with mechanical efficiency, that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have feelings that demanded attention. "I don't even know what I want anymore," she whispered. "I've been so busy being what everyone else needs that I've forgotten how to be myself." Rebecca stood up and walked around the counter, pulling Sarah into a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Sarah allowed herself to sink into the embrace, to feel held and seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "You know what?" Rebecca said, pulling back to look at Sarah directly. "Why don't you come to the shelter tomorrow? Not to volunteer necessarily, just to see what we do. Talk to some of the women if you feel like it. No pressure, no commitment, just remember what it feels like to be curious about someone else's story." Sarah wanted to say no. She had a dentist appointment tomorrow, and she needed to grocery shop, and the house needed cleaning before David's mother visited this weekend. There were a dozen reasons to maintain her carefully structured routine, to avoid the risk of stepping outside her comfort zone. But looking at Rebecca, at this friend who had somehow managed to build a life that seemed both meaningful and challenging, Sarah felt a spark of something she'd thought was permanently extinguished. "Okay," she heard herself saying. "Tomorrow afternoon? I can come after I pick up Emma." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "Perfect. And Sarah? Bring a notebook if you have one. You might be surprised what stories find you when you're ready to listen." After Rebecca left, Sarah stood in her kitchen holding the volunteer fair flyer her friend had left behind. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighted with possibility and terror in equal measure. She looked around her perfect kitchen at the evidence of her perfectly managed life, and for the first time in years she wondered what would happen if she stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real. The question followed her through the rest of the day. While she folded laundry with military precision, while she grocery shopped from the same list she'd been using for months, while she picked up Emma and listened to her daughter's animated recap of soccer practice. Even during dinner, as David discussed his caseload and Jake pushed food around his plate while scrolling through his phone, Sarah found herself wondering what stories were hidden beneath the surface of their routine interactions. That night, as she lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time she'd felt truly awake. Tomorrow, she would visit a women's shelter. Tomorrow, she would step outside the careful boundaries of her constructed life and see what was waiting for her there. For the first time in years, she fell asleep feeling something other than numb resignation. She fell asleep feeling curious about what tomorrow might bring. Chapter 3. Stories That Matter. The Westfield Women's Shelter occupied a converted Victorian house on the edge of downtown. Its wraparound porch painted a hopeful shade of yellow that stood out against the grey October sky. Sarah sat in her SUV across the street for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to convince herself she belonged here, that she had any right to intrude on other people's struggles when her own problems felt so privileged by comparison. Through the front windows she could see women moving about, some carrying children, others sitting in what looked like a common area. Their stories were written in their postures, in the way they held themselves with either defiant strength or careful guardedness. Sarah recognized something in those gestures, a kind of invisible armor she'd been wearing herself without realizing it. A tap on her passenger window made her jump. Rebecca stood there smiling, wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, looking more vibrant and alive than Sarah felt in her carefully coordinated outfit. "You made it," Rebecca said as Sarah rolled down the window. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out what I'm supposed to say to people who are dealing with real problems." Rebecca's expression grew serious. "Can I tell you something? The women in there, most of them spent years believing their problems weren't real either, that they didn't deserve help because someone else always had it worse. Pain isn't a competition, Sarah. Feeling lost is feeling lost no matter what your house looks like." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She grabbed her purse and the notebook she'd found in her desk drawer, a leather-bound journal David had given her 3 Christmases ago, still pristine because she'd never known what to write in it. The interior of the shelter was warm and welcoming, with mismatched furniture that somehow created a sense of home rather than institutional coldness. Children's artwork covered one wall, and the smell of coffee and something baking drifted from what must be the kitchen. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Maria Santos, our program coordinator," Rebecca said, introducing her to a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "Maria, this is the friend I told you about, the one who used to be a journalist." "Used to be," Sarah repeated with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm not sure I remember how to ask the right questions anymore." Maria's laugh was rich and genuine. "Honey, the right questions are usually the simple ones. How are you doing? What do you need? What's your story? People are dying to be heard. They just need someone willing to listen." As if summoned by their conversation, a young woman emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of sandwiches. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a toddler balanced on her hip. "This is Carmen," Maria said. "Carmen, meet Sarah. She might write some stories about our community here." Carmen set down the tray and extended her hand. "Stories like what?" "I honestly don't know yet," Sarah said, appreciating the directness of the question. "I'm just here to listen if anyone wants to talk." Something in Sarah's honesty seemed to resonate with Carmen. She adjusted the toddler, a little girl with enormous brown eyes, and gestured toward a quiet corner of the room. "I've got some time before Sophia's nap. You want to hear how I ended up here?" They settled into 2 comfortable chairs, while Sophia played with a set of blocks at their feet. Sarah opened her notebook, then hesitated. "Is it okay if I take notes? I won't use anything without your permission." "It's fine," Carmen said. "Maybe if people hear about it, other women won't wait as long as I did to leave." Carmen's story unfolded slowly, punctuated by moments when she'd paused to help Sophia with a particularly challenging block tower. She'd been married at 19 to a man who seemed charming and protective until the day after their wedding, when his protection turned into control. Small things at first, questioning her friendships, managing their finances, making decisions about her schedule without consulting her. "I kept thinking it was because he loved me so much," Carmen said, watching her daughter play. "He'd say he just wanted to take care of me, that he knew what was best. And I wanted to believe that, you know. I wanted to believe someone else could handle all the hard decisions." Sarah's pen stilled on the page. The words hit uncomfortably close to home, though her own situation was nothing like Carmen's in terms of severity or danger. "When did you realize it wasn't love?" Sarah asked softly. Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "When Sophia was born." I looked at her, and I thought about what I would want for her when she grew up. Would I want her to disappear into someone else's idea of who she should be? Would I want her to think her own thoughts and feelings didn't matter? The answer was so obvious, yet Sarah felt like she was hearing it for the first time. She thought about Emma, about the young woman her daughter was becoming. What kind of example was Sarah setting? What was she teaching Emma about a woman's worth, about the importance of her own dreams and desires? It took me 2 more years to leave, Carmen continued. 2 years of planning and saving money in secret, and finding the courage to believe I could take care of myself and Sophia. The hardest part wasn't the leaving. It was admitting I'd lost myself so completely that I didn't even know who I was anymore. Sarah looked up from her notebook to find Carmen watching her intently. "You know what I mean, don't you?" Carmen said. "About losing yourself." The question hung between them, honest and direct. Sarah could deflect, could redirect the conversation back to Carmen's experience, could maintain the professional distance she'd been taught to keep as a journalist. Instead, she found herself nodding. "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "I think I do." They talked for another hour, with Carmen sharing her plans for finishing her nursing degree and Sarah finding herself offering genuine encouragement and advice. When Sophia finally succumbed to exhaustion and curled up in her mother's lap for a nap, Carmen looked at Sarah thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What's your story? I mean, what brought you here today? Rebecca said you used to write for newspapers." Sarah closed her notebook and considered the question. When was the last time someone had asked about her story, her dreams, her experiences outside of her role as David's wife or Emma and Jake's mother? "I used to want to change the world," Sarah said finally. "I thought I could tell stories that mattered, shed light on important issues. I had all these big plans. What happened to those plans? Life, I guess. Marriage, kids, responsibilities. I convinced myself that being a good wife and mother was enough, that my old dreams were selfish." Sarah paused, looking around the shelter at the evidence of what happened when someone decided their dreams were worth fighting for. "But lately, I've been wondering if I gave up too easily." Carmen shifted Sophia to a more comfortable position, her voice gentle when she spoke again. "You know what I learned in counseling here? There's a difference between sacrifice and surrender. Sacrifice is giving up something for a greater purpose. Surrender is just giving up." The words settled into Sarah's chest like seeds finding fertile ground. She thought about all the small surrenders she'd made over the years, the writing opportunities she'd declined, the friendships she'd let fade, the parts of herself she'd quietly set aside in the name of being practical, responsible, mature. "I should let you get Sophia down for her nap," Sarah said, though she wasn't ready for the conversation to end. "Will you come back?" Carmen asked. "I'd like to hear how your story turns out." As Sarah drove home, she found herself taking a different route than usual, winding through downtown Westfield instead of heading straight for the suburbs. She passed the coffee shop where she'd occasionally treated herself to a latte, the bookstore she always meant to browse but never seemed to have time for, the small newspaper office that published the local weekly. At a red light, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found her mother's number. "Hi, Mom? Sarah, is everything all right? You never call in the middle of the day." "I'm fine. Actually, I wanted to ask you about something. Yesterday, when I asked if you ever felt like you were disappearing, I think I need to know your answer." The silence stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if her mother would hang up rather than engage with the question. Finally, her mother's voice came through, smaller and more vulnerable than Sarah had heard it in years. "Every day," she said quietly, "for about 15 years I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day. I loved you kids, and I loved your father, but I felt like Sarah, the person, had gotten lost somewhere in Sarah, the wife and mother. What did you do?" "Nothing, for a long time. I told myself it was normal, that it was what women did, put everyone else first. But when you kids got older and didn't need me as much, I realized I didn't know who I was anymore." Her mother paused. "That's when I started taking those art classes, remember? You were in high school, and you thought it was silly that I wanted to learn to paint." Sarah did remember, and she was ashamed to recall her teenage eye rolls at her mother's newfound passion for watercolors. "I didn't understand then. I'm not sure I understood either at the time. I just knew I needed something that was mine, something that reminded me I was still a person with my own thoughts and dreams." Her mother's voice grew stronger. "Sarah, honey, what's brought this on?" "I think I'm ready to stop disappearing," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm just not sure how to start becoming visible again." "One small step at a time," her mother said. "And sweetheart, It's never too late to remember who you are. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table long after David had gone upstairs to bed, and the kids had retreated to their rooms. Her notebook lay open in front of her, filled with Carmen's words and her own scattered thoughts. For the first time in years, she felt the familiar itch to write, to capture something true and meaningful on paper. She began with a single sentence. I used to believe that wanting things for myself made me selfish. From there, words flowed like water through a broken dam, carrying with them years of unexpressed thoughts and buried dreams. She wrote about the shelter, about Carmen's courage, about the women who were rebuilding their lives from scratch. But mostly, she wrote about the realization that her own cage was unlocked. She'd just forgotten to try the door. When she finally looked up, it was nearly midnight. Her neck was stiff, her hand cramped from writing, and she felt more alive than she had in years. Tomorrow, she would have to return to her routine, laundry and groceries, and the endless cycle of tasks that kept her family's life running smoothly. But tonight, she was a writer again. Tonight, she remembered what it felt like to have something to say. Chapter 4. Finding the Key. Sarah woke up before her alarm for the first time in months, not from anxiety or obligation, but from genuine excitement. The notebook lay on her nightstand where she'd placed it the night before, filled with words she'd forgotten she knew how to arrange. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could almost pretend the previous day had been a dream, that she hadn't spent hours at a women's shelter, hadn't rediscovered her voice, hadn't felt the stirring of something she'd thought was permanently dormant. But as she slipped downstairs to begin her morning routine, the notebook came with her, a tangible reminder that something had shifted. She made coffee with the same practiced motions, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about Carmen's story, about the article she could write, about the editor of the local weekly paper she'd driven past yesterday. "You're up early, even for you," David said, as he entered the kitchen at his usual time. "Everything okay?" Sarah looked up from where she'd been reading over her notes, suddenly aware of how foreign this must seem. His wife sitting at the breakfast table with a notebook and pen, looking energized instead of resigned. "I went to visit Rebecca yesterday," she said, closing the notebook. "Do you remember Rebecca Chen from college?" "Vaguely." "The activist one?" David poured his coffee, his attention already half focused on his phone. "What's she up to these days?" "She runs a women's shelter downtown. She asked me to visit to maybe write something about the work they do there." David paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Write something? Like, for a newspaper?" The question carried an undertone Sarah couldn't quite identify. Surprise, concern, skepticism. She'd become so accustomed to defining herself through his reactions that she almost let his tone deflate her newfound enthusiasm. "Maybe. I met this young woman yesterday, Carmen. She has an incredible story of courage and survival. I think people should hear it." "That's great, honey, but you know how busy you are with Emma's soccer season and Jake's college prep. Plus, my mother's visit this weekend and we have the Hendersons' anniversary party next month." David's voice carried the gentle condescension she'd learned to accept as normal, the implication that her sudden interest was a cute hobby she'd abandon once she remembered her real responsibilities. But yesterday had changed something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of herself. Instead of nodding and agreeing, she felt a spark of irritation. "I can manage my schedule, David. I've been managing everyone's schedule for 15 years. He looked at her more closely then, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. "Of course, I just meant, it's been a long time since you've written anything. Are you sure you want to put yourself out there like that?" The words stung because they echoed her own fears. What if she'd lost her ability to craft a compelling story? What if 15 years of domestic routine had dulled whatever talent she'd once possessed? But then she remembered the feeling of her pen moving across the page last night, the way the words had come alive under her fingers. "Maybe I'm not sure," Sarah said quietly, "but I think I need to try anyway." Jake wandered into the kitchen, hair disheveled, reaching automatically for the coffee maker. He paused when he noticed the notebook on the table. "What's that, Mom? You keeping a diary now?" "I'm writing again," Sarah said, testing how the words felt in her mouth. "About some people I met yesterday." "Cool," Jake said, and Sarah was surprised by how much his casual acceptance meant to her. At 16, he was old enough to remember the bedtime stories she used to make up for him and Emma, elaborate adventures featuring brave knights and clever princesses who solved their own problems. When had she stopped being creative around her children? Emma burst through the back door, already in her soccer uniform, cheeks flushed from morning practice. "Mum, Coach wants to know if you can help with the team newsletter this season. She said you used to be a writer or something. Sarah felt David's eyes on her as she answered, I'd like that, Em. Tell Coach I'll call her today. The rest of the morning passed in its familiar rhythm, but Sarah carried herself differently. She stood straighter, spoke with more certainty, made decisions without second-guessing herself. Small changes, but she felt them in her bones. After dropping Emma at school, Sarah found herself driving toward downtown instead of heading home. The Westfield Weekly occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a deli, its windows plastered with community event flyers and local business advertisements. Sarah had driven past it hundreds of times, but had never really seen it before. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and a woman with grey hair and reading glasses looked up from a computer screen cluttered with papers. Can I help you? I hope so. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I was wondering if you ever accept freelance articles. The woman, whose desk nameplate read Janet Morrison, editor, leaned back in her chair and studied Sarah with interest. Depends on the article. What did you have in mind? Sarah pulled out her notebook, her hands steadier than she'd expected. There's a women's shelter here in town that's doing incredible work. I spent some time there yesterday and met women with stories that I think the community should hear. Not just the statistics about domestic violence, but the human stories of survival and rebuilding. Janet's expression grew more attentive. You're talking about Rebecca Chen's place? The Westfield Women's Shelter? You know Rebecca? I've been trying to get someone out there for months. Rebecca's too modest to push for coverage, but that place is a lifeline for women throughout the county. Janet pulled out a pen and paper. Tell me about your background. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nerves. I studied journalism at Rutgers, worked briefly for a paper right after college. But that was 15 years ago. And what have you been doing for 15 years? Raising children, managing a household, being... Sarah paused, searching for the right words. Being everyone except myself, I think. Janet's smile was knowing. I took 8 years off when my kids were young. Thought I'd never be able to write again. Turns out raising children teaches you things about people, about resilience and courage, that make you a better storyteller. When can you have something to me? You're saying yes, just like that? I'm saying I'll look at what you write. If it's good, we'll run it. If it's not, Janet shrugged, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Sarah, the fact that you walked in here today tells me something important about your story. You're ready to be heard. Sarah drove home in a daze, Janet's words echoing in her mind. She had a deadline, 2 weeks to write an article that could actually be published, actually read by people in her community. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She spent the afternoon at the shelter, notebook in hand, talking to Maria about the shelter's programs and interviewing 2 more residents who were willing to share their experiences. Each conversation revealed layers of complexity she hadn't expected. Women who were survivors, but also mothers, students, dreamers, artists. Their stories weren't just about escape from bad situations. They were about the courage to imagine better lives and the determination to create them. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table again, but this time she wasn't alone. Emma had finished her homework early and curled up in the adjacent chair with a book, while Jake worked on a history project across from her. David emerged from his office around 9, tie loosened, looking tired but curious about the unusual scene. Family study hall? He asked. Mum's writing an article for the newspaper, Emma announced proudly, about the women's shelter downtown. David looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. How did that happen? I walked into their office today and pitched them the story, Sarah said, not looking up from her notebook. They want it in 2 weeks. That's fast. I've been waiting 15 years to write something that matters, Sarah replied. I think I'm ready. Jake looked up from his textbook. What's it about? Sarah set down her pen and considered the question. How could she explain the complexity of what she was trying to capture? It's about women who thought they were trapped, who discovered they had more strength than they knew. It's about the difference between giving up and starting over. It's about... She paused, looking around the table at her family. It's about remembering that you're allowed to want things for yourself, even when you love other people. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Emma smiled and returned to her book. Jake nodded thoughtfully and went back to his homework. David sat down at the table, pulling out his own laptop. Mind if I work here too? He asked. It's nice having everyone together. As the evening deepened around them, Sarah wrote steadily, the words flowing with increasing confidence. She wrote about Carmen's journey from isolation to independence, about Maria's vision for community healing, about Rebecca's courage in building something meaningful from scratch. But threading through all of it was her growing understanding that these women's stories were also somehow her story. Around midnight, David closed his laptop and stretched. "I'm heading up. You coming?" Sarah looked at her notebook, pages now filled with the first draft of something she was genuinely proud of. "In a few minutes, I just want to finish this section." David paused behind her chair, reading over her shoulder. "This is really good, Sarah. I mean it. I'd forgotten how talented you are." The compliment meant more than it should have, but Sarah recognized the danger in needing his approval to feel legitimate. "Thank you," she said simply. After he'd gone upstairs, Sarah read through what she'd written, making notes and revisions. The article was taking shape, but more than that, she could feel herself taking shape too. With each sentence, she was remembering what it felt like to have something important to say, to trust her own voice, to believe that her perspective mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "How did today go? Heard through the grapevine that you visited Janet Morrison." Sarah smiled as she typed back, "News travels fast in small towns. It went well, really well. Thank you for giving me permission to remember who I am." "You gave yourself permission. I just opened the door." Sarah looked around her kitchen, the same space where she'd felt so trapped just days ago. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. The room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a launching pad. She thought about Carmen, who had looked at her sleeping daughter and decided to choose courage over comfort. She thought about Rebecca, who had walked away from financial security to build something meaningful. She thought about her mother, who had picked up a paintbrush at 45 and discovered parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. Sarah closed her notebook and headed upstairs, but she left it on the kitchen table where she could see it first thing in the morning. Tomorrow she would continue writing. She would finish the article, submit it to Janet, and see what happened next. But more importantly, she would continue the larger project of rediscovering herself, one honest word at a time. For the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep thinking about the future instead of just getting through the next day. She fell asleep planning instead of just surviving, dreaming instead of just existing. She fell asleep as a writer again, and that made all the difference. 2 weeks later, Sarah's article appeared on the front page of the Westfield Weekly with the headline, "Finding Home Local Shelter Offers Second Chances." The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and 3 more women contacted the shelter seeking help. But for Sarah, the most meaningful response came from Carmen, who called her the morning the article was published. "I read it 3 times, Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. "You told my story, but you told it in a way that made me sound heroic, like I was brave instead of just desperate." "You are brave," Sarah replied. "Braver than I ever realized. You know what's funny? Reading about myself in the newspaper made me believe it might actually be true, that maybe I really am someone worth rooting for." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen with the newspaper spread in front of her, her byline clear and proud at the top of the page. David had already left for work, but not before telling her how proud he was, how impressed his colleagues were when he'd shown them the article. Emma had taken copies to show her friends and teachers. Jake had actually read the entire piece and asked thoughtful questions about the women she'd interviewed, but the validation that mattered most came from within. She had written something true and important. She had used her voice to amplify other voices that needed to be heard. She had remembered what it felt like to be fully herself. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Janet Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah, I hope you're sitting down. I've had 6 calls this morning from other publications wanting to know if they can reprint your article. The County Times wants to know if you'd be interested in writing a monthly column about social issues. And I just got off the phone with a literary agent in New York who read the piece online and wants to know if you'd ever consider writing a book." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. What? I'm saying congratulations, my dear. You're a writer again. The question is, what do you want to do about it? As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized she didn't need time to think about Janet's question. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. She wanted to write more stories, tell more truths, give voice to more women who had forgotten they had something worth saying. She wanted to build a career that mattered, on her own terms, in her own time. Most importantly, she wanted to show Emma and Jake what it looked like when someone decided to stop disappearing and start living fully. She wanted to teach them that love didn't require self-erasure, that being a good mother meant being a whole person, that dreams deferred weren't necessarily dreams destroyed. Sarah opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write her next story. This one would be about a woman who thought she was trapped in someone else's life, who discovered that the cage door had been unlocked all along, who finally found the courage to step outside and see what was waiting for her in the wide, bright world beyond her own fears. It was the story she'd been waiting 15 years to tell, and finally, she was ready to tell it. The end. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if my story touched your heart today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next confession. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and share it with another woman who needs to know she's not alone. Together, our voices are stronger.